Hello and welcome back to Season 2, Episode 5. Today we have a very special guest, a former producer from the NBC Sports and MLB Network. He's a three-time Emmy Award winner who has now dedicated his time to the students here at Sacred Heart University. Professor John Barnes, how are you doing today, John?
Doing great. Thank you for having me, Chase.
Oh, happy to have you. So I just kind of want to get started, jump into the beginning of your career. So you studied film, television, and theater at the University of Notre Dame. Go Fighting Irish. And what sparked your interest in storytelling and television production?
I always watched TV. So if it was sports or really anything that was on TV, I loved it. So when I got to college, when I went to Notre Dame, I grew up like 15 minutes from campus. So, it was always my dream to go there. And then once I discovered that there was a major like film and television, I thought, oh, this sounds exactly like what I've always wanted to do. And just kind of like went through the schooling there and didn't really have like a clear idea of, where I wanted to end up 20 years later, but knew that I wanted to be involved in TV or media. And so, kind of this got to join the student radio station and call Notre Dame basketball games, Notre Dame football games. And I think just with each little bite I got of doing something either in live TV or live radio or anything like that, I just wanted more and more and more. I wish I could say I, had a grand plan at the age of 20, but I did not. I just knew that I loved sports and I love TV. And if I could do something that combined both of them, I would pursue it and do whatever I could.
That's awesome. And, University of Notre Dame, legendary institution, so definitely a great place to start.
Yeah.
And then you ended up going back to school to get your master's in journalism from St. Bonaventure University. What motivated you to go back to school at that stage in your career?
So at the time when I decided to get my master's, like I had been a sports producer, or at least working in sports production, sports television for over 20 years. Loved it. I think if anybody's interested in sports television or sports production, I don't think it's a mystery. Like, the hours are different. You work a lot of weekends, and especially if you're working live events, you go on the road a lot. So it was great. I had a blast. But was after about 22 years of doing it and, kind of like living out of a suitcase for 5 or 6 years. I wanted to kind of see if there was a pivot or something else that I could do with my career. And I got a position as an adjunct instructor. And I loved it. I was teaching sports production. And so immediately, after becoming an adjunct, I thought, okay, well, this is something that if I'm not going to be a producer for the next 25 years, this is something where I think like I could do a good job at it, and it would still be storytelling, at least kind of like sharing stories or sharing some expertise with, the students that would listen to me. But once I kind of thought that was a path, I realized I needed a master's degree because even though I had been producing and working in sports production for over 2 decades, a lot of like the things that you learn as a graduate student were things that I needed either to be refreshed on or just hadn't thought about or hadn't really focused on since I had been back at school. And so getting a master's degree in journalism I learned, I knew I was going to learn a lot. I learned more than I ever thought I would, getting a master's degree. And it's really helped me. It's been probably the most important kind of step to being what I hope to be, and that's a pretty good teacher. So kind of using that schooling, those journalism guidelines and that journalism background, and then combine it with like, some of my stories from being a producer, I think gives me a pretty good balance as a professor.
Absolutely. It gives you that experience to disseminate upon all the students of, real life stories of, I was here, I was
Yeah.
there, this is what I did. Great stuff. So, we kind of talked about where you are currently. I wanted to take it back to 2004 when you started at ESPN as a
Yeah.
production assistant. So tell me how you got your first gig there at ESPN.
So when I left college or when I graduated from my undergraduate degree at Notre Dame, I went and worked for one of my professors at Notre Dame who had a role at a local radio station. And so I worked at the local radio station. That was my first job out of school. Um, Doing morning news reports for like kind of the morning show. I would be like, I'd be the guy um, on the air every hour. Hey, these are the three big stories in Elkhart, Indiana this morning. There's a water main break. The football teams in the sectional finals and stuff like that. And then I would call high school games on Friday nights or Tuesday nights or wherever the basketball games were. And then I saw a posting for a temp production assistant role at ESPN and applied for it. I was lucky enough to get to actually make it to a round of interviews and just kind of had a couple interviews and end up getting the role. So it was there was no, again, I feel like this might be um a common theme of this. There's no grand plan. It's just kind of like, hey, had the alert, like had job alerts up, like knew ESPN was somewhere like that I would love to eventually work at, and saw a position that was, I think at the time, it was like a 5 or 6 month position. They called them temp production assistant roles. I don't know if they still have them, but was
They
fortunate.
do actually, yeah.
Yeah, so I was fortunate enough to get it, and once I got it, I packed my car and drove from South Bend, Indiana, out to Bristol, Connecticut. Put everything that I could fit into my Chevy Malibu and drove out there. And knowing that if it was 5 months, then I would have a great 5 months hopefully, and come back. But once I was there, I think one of the first things that I worked on was around this time, back in 2004 was Champ Week. And so it was college basketball. It was all the different conference tournaments going on. And it was so much fun, um, you know, to actually have a job where I was watching, the MAC semifinals, or the Ohio Valley semifinals, and cutting 20-second highlights for, at the time, what was called, I don't know if they still call it, but Raps shows. So it was basically, if it was before a game, halftime, or after a game. At that point, ESPN had their own group called Raps that would handle those intermissions, or those, those studio segments, and did a good enough job that eventually I got offered a, kind of an extension, and was able to stay there past the 5 or 6 months that I was initially supposed to be there.
And kind of talking about the entry level role at ESPN, what were some of the like foundational skills that you kind of carried with you from that job to, eventually you ended up at NBC? But like, what were some of the foundational things you learned?
Yeah, like one of my first, if not my first boss at ESPN, his name was Dan Steer, and I eventually ended up working for him at NBC Sports. But he oversaw college basketball, and I think if you talk to anybody that was at ESPN from the '90s or the 2000s or the 2010s, they'd have a Dan Steer story. But it sticks with me to this day. Like, he would just say, like, produce your position was one of his favorite kind of like directives for his employees. Produce your position. So that means, like, whatever you're doing, do it the best that you can, and think about how you can improve it, or think about how you can kind of support whoever is on your team or whoever you're working for. So like that kind of like overall, macro approach was something that really stuck with me. Produce your position. And then really like working at a place like ESPN that's such like a machine, like an operation, like learning things like how to do a shot sheet, how to do a cut sheet, um, you know, watching other people do jobs that, hopefully I wanted to, or hopefully I would get to do one day. When you're, so I had some pretty hands-on, like pretty like basic, like kind of like skills that I was taught, like shot sheet, situation, action, result. Like, right, cut sheet, this, you have to put your last shot change, like what the out cue is, all that. So like all the, like, I want to say all like the basics, but like the building blocks of like how to actually like, give someone a highlight, or, edit a VO together,
Right.
or edit B-roll together. I learned all that stuff there, but then it was just, that overall, like, produce your position, and then just watching other people that were really good at what they did, and seeing what made them successful. And one of the things that I learned pretty early on was that in sports and live television, um, you know, 7 o'clock's coming, whether or not you're ready or not. And halftime's coming, whether or not you are ready or not. And so
Absolutely.
to be really, really direct and clear with how I communicated. Like if if I had what I needed to have, if I didn't, you can't hide. So if those times where like I messed up, um, own it and learn from it, and always, always, always try to be honest with what you have. Because I think if you've worked with, I don't know if that makes any sense, but if you've worked in live TV, there's nothing worse than somebody asking if you have something, or, how you're doing, and you just don't say anything, or you try to like fake it, or you try to kind of like BS your way into, into hopefully eventually finding the right answer. Like I learned pretty early on at ESPN, like just be direct, be like, nope, don't have it, working on it, or I'll get it to you in 3 minutes. And if you say you're going to have it in 3 minutes, it better be 3 minutes. It better not be 3.5 minutes. It better not be 4 minutes. Like try to be as clear and honest. And, everybody's going to mess up, and then just own it. Even if it's not 100% your fault, if you get blamed for it, like just to kind of be like, all right, no problem. I learned that. I learned that really early on too. Like mistakes happen. And if you start pointing the finger, people remember that, and people will, you know, remember that you're the type of person that either points the finger, or you're the type of person that says, "Yep, my bad. I'll work on it next time." And I think, you know, it's a roundabout way of answering your question, but those are the things like I really, really, really remember learning within like the first 5 months at ESPN.
I think those are two great takeaways. Like at the end of the day, communication and accountability
Yeah.
are huge, especially in a control room. Um, but I did want to kind of talk about, you said there was no master plan in your career, but when did you kind of realize that producing was the role or the path that you kind of wanted to pursue? Was it at ESPN, or was it once you got to NBC with your next job?
No, it was at MLB Network. Like at ESPN, and I went to well, at the time it was called Comcast Sportsnet in Chicago, because I wanted to go back to Chicago. Even when I was at those two places, I thought that I would have, I envisioned myself as like a feature producer, like doing kind of the long form, like, pregame 3.5 minute tearjerker feature, or
Yeah, telling some stories and
yeah,
stuff. Yeah.
yes. So, and I really thought that I thought that's what I was going to do. But when I got to MLB Network, I had never worked at a place that was like launching a network. And it was, I learned more, I think, in the 4 or 5 months that we launched MLB Network than I did, um, in my entire career up to that point, just because like launching that, like you might think you have the blueprint, or you might think that we've got all our bases covered, but something's going to pop up that eventually nobody thought of, or that nobody was assigned to. And so I started raising my hand and trying to do all these different things. Like, yeah, I'll be the guy that like manages the music, like whether or not we can get like commercial music, or, how to get like literally highlight cuts from our music library to the audio person. So I started doing that. And then I got involved in a show, called Intentional Talk, which was like a show that launched at a network that had launched a year and a half earlier, and working with that group and that team, um, the opportunity to produce popped up, and I really didn't think that I was going to go down that path. But I had a couple, like, some great mentors that said, "Hey, give it a shot." And then once I did it, I was like, "Oh, okay, okay. Like this is awesome. Like I really like this." Like, I thought I knew where I wanted to go. But once I got that, and I've never would have gotten that chance somewhere else that quick, I think, because it was going to a network that had just launched a show that had launched after a year and a half of, MLB Tonight, being the flagship show for that network. Um, and the first couple times I produced, I was like, "Oh, okay, okay. This is why everybody like loves this and wants to do this." And so then, I had a blast doing it, and got to do, um, a studio daily show, which is my favorite thing to do. Something that you're just doing every day, and you're working with like the same people every day, and you really like, within a month, you'll do 25 shows and feel like you guys have you've been working together for 15 years, because just coming up with something new or building something from scratch every day was so much fun. And I think like that that gave me kind of a fast track and like a really accelerated education into like how to produce and what it takes to be a good producer working on that show. And once I realized what it was, like I was like, okay, yeah, this is what I want to do.
That's awesome. So kind of wanted to touch on a couple things
Yeah.
you mentioned there. I too, when I came here to Sacred Heart, I thought I wanted to be a features producer. Having worked on Sports Buzz and
Mhm.
the live event, I want to direct. That's my
Yeah.
dream now after coming here. Um, but yeah, like you said about the studio show, I agree. I mean, having worked on Sports Buzz here, it's really like you get very comfortable with each other, especially when you work with the same crew over
Yeah.
and over again. You start to learn what are people's strengths, what are people's weaknesses, how you can help each other out each week, stuff like that. So, I mean, there's really nothing like it. It's a very cool environment, and like you said, it's definitely an electric feeling.
Well,
Um,
and I hate to cut you off, but like
Go ahead.
that's what I've been so excited and like just impressed by seeing students at Sacred Heart. That you are doing so much stuff like every day, like live broadcast, studio show, like you're coming out of. I feel like college students, especially Sacred Heart students, are coming or entering the workforce with like years of reps that like I didn't have when I left college. But, so I think it's a great thing because you get to kind of figure out what you really like and what you might be best at. Not saying you can't change your mind down the road, but like you're in it and you get to see like, oh, this is what this does. This is what this does. I don't just have to hear about it from, somebody that worked there for 20 years and I never got to see him do it. You get to see you get to see what it
Exactly.
actually is. Yeah. Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
No, no, you're good. No worries at all. But you did kind of segue into my next
Mhm.
question. You kind of talked about it a little bit, but I wanted to discuss what was the biggest adversity in launching MLB Network and the shows that you were doing? Was there anything that stuck out to you as like that was a real learning lesson?
Yeah. How much time do you have? I remember like we didn't, I was an associate producer at the time. We didn't think that we were gonna have to edit our own stuff. And within like 2 weeks, a lot of the associate producers or productions realized, okay, like we're gonna have to edit, like, cause like, like there's nobody to do it. And so like we had to learn, I had never used editing software before. And so, you know, a month before we launched, like at that time, it was the largest cable launch in television history. I think that, back in 2009. And then you realize like, oh, we're gonna have to teach ourselves how to edit pretty quickly here. And if you can't figure that out, like, yeah,
Trial by fire,
see you
as they
later.
say.
But like it was just like it was really, it's gonna sound so corny. It was really difficult to do anything because it was the first time we were doing everything. And sometimes people would be in positions that they thought they were the positions that they wanted to be in. Found out really quickly, like, no, like this person should be over here. I should be over here. I should be over here. And kind of doing that on the fly, it was like it was an ego check, like, to realize like because I think, like at that point, I don't think there was a ton of people where it was their first job. I think a lot of people had come from ESPN and like had done Sports Center, and like I came from ESPN and then a regional sports network. There's other people that are coming from the West Coast, like people are coming from all over that loved baseball, that were like, I want to work for like the first network that does baseball
Right.
24/7. And just stuff didn't work. And so like you had to figure out, I wish I had like more specifics, but like pick a pick a device that is used in television and it didn't work at some point. And you just had to like figure it out. And, you know, um, and if you didn't figure it out, like you got you got left behind real quick. So uh, it was stressful, but it was some of the most fun I've ever had. Because I think, like I said, like there were times where people were just like, "There's nobody to do this," and you're like, "Oh, I'll give it a shot." And it's not, and it wasn't like, "Oh, you get an extra bump in your title and you get extra pay." Like, no, like nobody's doing it. You want to do it? Sure. All right, you're in charge of it now. You're like, I okay, maybe I shouldn't have
You're like,
volunteered.
what did I get myself
Yeah,
into?
exactly. What did I get myself into? So, so it's just kind of like just for someone like me that I've got some technical know-how, but I like more of the storytelling, or I feel like I've that's always been a little bit more my strength to kind of work at a place where like stuff didn't work all the time and I had to figure it out was a huge, huge challenge. Mhm.
And I think, talking about challenges, like that's where you grow the most.
Yeah.
That's like you said, these are learning experiences where you kind of figure out things on the fly, things you didn't know before. But once you get it down, you're all of a sudden a well-oiled machine.
Mhm.
And talking about a well-oiled machine, this team was very, creative, very effective. Wanted to kind of touch on the 3 Emmy Awards. So sports television is such a collaborative environment. When you look back at those Emmy Awards from the MLB Network, what do they say about the teams that you worked with?
They were really good. And now I'm not getting too much in the weeds, but like sports Emmys, like, like kind of the rules and how you submit stuff. It's a little bit of an inexact science, but I think, I remember something that at the time he was the president of our network, Tony Petiti, who's now the commissioner of the Big Ten. He said, like, at that time, those first couple years, MLB Network didn't have playoff games, didn't have like wild card LCSs or anything like that. They eventually got some playoff games, but early on said, we don't have playoff games. So how we're going to make our name for ourselves is to like kind of put out like the best studio show. And he really like, he had people kind of, monitoring the show every night to kind of, highlight clips that we thought were, worthy of putting on an Emmy tape. And so he really kind of like laid the groundwork to be like, this is how we're going to um, kind of like make our mark, is to kind of make this MLB Tonight show like the best, not just baseball show, but best studio show out there. And I think it won like the Emmy 3 years in a row. Like it's like or 3 out of the first 4 years, which is um,
Incredible,
pretty incredible.
impressive.
Yeah. And really, it was, and like, I did learn like, having different studios. So we had like a studio that was kind of your more traditional, sitting at a desk, doing highlights, talking, right? But then we had the baseball studio, Studio 42. And that was a whole nother world. That was a game changer where we could take, especially if you're doing, I don't know if you've watched MLB Night, but like, it's the entire night of baseball. So
Oh yeah, there's a lot to cover.
yeah, it's not the same people for 6 hours, but it's the show is on and like new talent come in halfway through, but it's on for 6 hours. And so to get, at least to get the analysts, the talent to walk over to the studio and do some demos and kind of lean into like kind of their baseball knowledge, because I think, you know, um, knowing your audience is a really important thing in any
Absolutely.
storytelling. And I think, to kind of know, like, look, like, we don't want to necessarily get too complicated, but we know we got hardcore baseball fans watching this. So we can go over to Studio 42 and have a former big league hitter, a former big league pitcher, like, spend 5 minutes about how to like grip a circle changeup or something like that. And it led to some really just like spectacular like moments. And, kind of the way that, those moments turned into Emmys, I think was like we made a concerted effort to kind of like track them nightly and be like, okay, like, yeah, like, because like I think, I don't know if, you do, I'm sure everybody that works, on Sports Buzz or anything like that, like remembers like these awesome moments. But like if you do 15 shows, one every week, like it's hard to kind of go back to be like, hey, what show was that really good? Remember like
It all just blends
3 months
together.
ago, what was that? 3 months ago or 2 months, something like that. So I think like to kind of like have the real estate to do those really cool different things, and then to have the foresight to, kind of track them in real time. What was something that Tony did well.
You played a key role in the 2018 and 2020 Olympics. What makes producing such a challenge for these events? Is it the fact that you have to tell so many stories?
Yes. Well, yes. And then, it's a challenge because I think like for me, someone that like loves sports, but I'm not going to pretend like I know all the Olympic sports and I follow them, all the time. To produce an Olympics, you really have to, you know, you can find amazing stories anywhere because like these are just like, like some of the best athletes, if not the best athletes in the world. And there's so many athletes to choose from and Olympians to choose from. Like if you do your research and your homework, like you will find spectacular stories. But to present that to an audience that I think like, you know, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn, probably doesn't pay attention to most of the sports for 3 years and 50 weeks or whatever. Like,
Right.
a lot of the audience comes to the Olympics like, hey, this is the first time I'm watching, um, speed skating since the last Winter Olympics, or this is the first time I'm watching like, the uneven bars gymnastics routine since the last time I watched the Olympics. Like there's a lot of people that's how they consume the Olympics, and you don't want to talk down to those people, or pardon me, you don't want to talk down to the audience by like, um, kind of making everything so kind of like elementary or like basic, but you have to like put a show together that acknowledges that, hey, a lot of the people watching this have not watched this sport since the last Olympics. So how can you know, cover the sport and make sure people kind of understand what they're watching, but also focus on, the human element. And I think that's where like I really, at least like doing studio shows, you know, we would kind of bounce around to different events and didn't necessarily have to set up all the rules of each event or kind of have like, break down like the scoring for some of the more, kind of like difficult to understand events. But really kind of like focus on, all right, obviously, what are the best American stories since I was working for an American broadcaster, but,
Right.
like what are just the best overall human stories, and try to find like a theme throughout the day that you could kind of, you know, go back to. Because if you kind of just like, or at least I found out pretty quickly, if I would just enter, let's just say day 3 without kind of having an idea of who are the athletes that I think the biggest athletes that American audiences are interested in. How are we going to kind of like, surround this 2 hours of a live event, and how are we going to like update people about other stuff that's going on, or at least kind of, add to what the event's doing. Like if you didn't have a really, really detailed plan, like it'd be underwater real quick because there's just so much going on all the time. And I didn't cover the Paris Olympics, but before I left NBC, I was going to work on the Gold Zone show, which is kind of like red zone for the Olympics. And that I think that's like such a great innovation for the Olympics, and that was something that like, I was really super excited to do since I had kind of worked at uh, MLB Network, where MLB Tonight was kind of always bouncing around to different events based on, oh, there's the bases loaded in this game,
Right.
this batter's up, let's go there. And I think like the Gold Zone for the Olympics is such an awesome way at least for me, it's such an awesome way to like consume the Olympics, because you're just bouncing around to event. And it really kind of, I think it's the first, kind of live broadcast that I've watched for the Olympics that kind of gives you a real sense of just how much is happening all the time.
So kind of touching on what you mentioned about trying to convey the rules or just the sports that are being played that people might not be familiar with. Would you say that the summer or the winter Olympics are harder? Cuz I would personally think that the winter Olympics would be harder just because there's more sports that people are unfamiliar with, like curling or stuff like that, versus the summer it's going to be basketball and
Yeah.
volleyball.
Yeah. And I think, I know there's, um, the Summer Olympics has gymnastics, which is scoring, but like kind of the big events in the summer, some of the big events are, swimming, track, and those are races. Like it's easy to tell who comes in first, second, third, or not easy to, but like, the winner is like, like some of the, like speed skating is like that. And like, skiing's like that, but like, figure skating, I still have a hard time understanding like the deductions, or at least like, kind of what,
The point system and
yeah.
stuff like
And
that.
like, I thought NBC did an awesome job this year of like kind of, using replays and using, really kind of hammering home like, hey, look, that little thing right there, that's worth this amount of points. But yeah, I would, at least for me, I would say like the Winter Olympics have a little bit more, they have more sports that are like a little harder barrier of entry to kind of figure out, what exactly is going on each time.
Right.
Mhm.
And final question about the Olympics,
Yeah.
but when you talk about preparation, what kind of timeline does it look like preparing for Olympics? Is it months out? Is it even a year out? Like when you start looking at, okay, how are things falling? Like where are the storylines? Are you doing your research like at a certain point before? Or is it kind of like the month of?
It's longer than that. And like, so when I did the Olympics, I was working on other sports, and then I would come in and do the Olympics for those, 3 weeks or whatever. But up until, a year leading up into that, like I was involved in research meetings or talking with um folks that were like full-time Olympics at NBC. And like the full-time Olympics storytelling group at NBC, that's all year round every year. And they have to they have to operate like that because like there's so many there's so much planning that goes into Olympics. There's so many details that go into like kind of like setting up, what the studios look like there, getting all like get crewing it and like making sure like you've got announcers for every event. So even outside of like the research and the storytelling, just like staffing the Olympics is you know a full-time job for 4 years leading into each Olympics. But like as someone that would, I don't want to say dip in, but I was working on other sports, and then pretty much at NBC, like everybody at NBC is working on the Olympics for those 3 weeks, no matter what department you're in. It's all hands on deck to kind of run the Olympics. But I would be in meetings, a year out with, kind of like like the main, producers, executives, or researchers covering the Olympics to try to hey, like this is something you need to watch, and I think NBC, um, at least since I've really been paying attention since working the Olympics, like they do a really good job of broadcasting kind of some of those, whether or not they're U.S. events, pardon me, U.S. championships, or like events in those sports leading up to the Olympics. So a track and field meet here, a swimming event here, and those Olympics, the Olympics storytelling group will use those events to start building up this new crop of Olympians that everybody's going to be rooting for in, whatever, 4 years. And so that's a part of, not only just preparing for the actual Olympics, but kind of building up those events that are the qualifiers, or, whatever events that kind of turn, you know, I don't want to say like unknown, but, like turn um, the athletes into kind of the favorites, or the people that, we want to focus on, once the
Yeah, it's
Olympics.
stuff that humanizes them and makes
Yeah.
people relate.
Well, and especially like, hey, like, oh yeah, I've heard of this person, like, or like kind of, if you watch a swim meet 2 years before the Olympics, like, hey, this is the, this person from the U.S. is like dominant in this race, and so this is somebody that's going to be a favorite when it comes to LA 28 or whatever, and
Right.
introduce those soon to be kind of hopefully like household names.
And so now kind of jumping in from your transition from producing to teaching, you started teaching at Quinnipiac.
Yep. Yep.
Um what was that transition like and what inspired that move?
The transition was, yeah, I was still, I was an adjunct while I was still working. So I was still working at NBC and kind of doing, being an adjunct professor like once a week. So I would go up there, teach graduate students, teach them like a sports production class, a studio class on like, at night. So it was something that I could do while I was still working. But like, even if I thought that like, I could just, which I didn't, but even if I thought I could just go in there and just wing it and just kind of be like, oh yeah, I'll just tell all my stories or stuff like that. Like I learned really quick. Like you need to have just like anything, you need to have a clear plan, a clear vision of what you want the class to be, because there's 15, 20 people looking at you. And like, college students could smell a BS artist pretty quick. If I was just like, hey, we'll just wing it and stuff like, like, yeah, sure. Yeah. Just get in there. But every class I taught, I really, it's going to sound cliche. I learned a lot about, okay, the next time I do this, I'm going to do this, and this differently, and this the same. And so I would just try to like write notes. And, I've even learned that, this is my first full year at Sacred Heart. Like I'm teaching classes this semester that I taught last semester. and I'd walk out of a class last and be like, oh my gosh, when I do that next to it, I'm going to change this, this, and this. So I don't say it's like anything, but like the first time you do something, you're just like, oh, okay, like that did not go the way I thought it was going to go in my head, or like, oh, that actually resonated a little bit more. So let me focus on this, or, kind of do that when I do it the next time. But what inspired the transition, I think, was like another part of your question. Um, yeah, like I'm not gonna lie, like sports production is awesome, but like I've got a family, couple little kids, and so like being on the road all the time, and like started to get a little taxing, and he was missing a lot of stuff. Because sports are at night and on the weekends, and they're on holidays, and like that's when they are. So like you're not going to work in sports TV, and the person that works in sports TV that works 9 to 5 Monday through Friday for their entire career, like that's going to be the first person to ever achieve that goal. So like,
That's very true.
yeah,
And
so
that's a great transition into my
yeah.
next question because I did want to touch on work-life balance. It's a question I ask everybody about, but like what does that look like for you like at the time when you were producing? You said you're on the road a lot. It's kind of the nature of the job. How did you kind of manage that? And then ultimately like, you kind of were searching for more balance and, more of your own life, personal life at home. So like what did that look like for you in that transition?
Well, Chase, if I really managed the work-life balance, I might not have left television. No, it was, it's kind of like I learned, or not learned, but I realized pretty quick, like if I'm going to be working and I'm going to be on the road, like I can't be in two places at once. So when I'm at wherever I am, like be in that, be there, be present there, like, do whatever I'm there to do. And so whether or not that was working, um, like there's no sense in like, lamenting like, oh, I'm not at home and I'm missing this. It sucked, but I was there. And so I was like, all right, well, I'm at work. So I'm gonna do the best I can. And when I got home, I'd still have some work to do, but I was lucky enough for most of my career to have some bosses that were, if you're traveling, they'd be like, hey, when you're at home, like, be at home. And so I would try to cram in, 7 days worth of stuff into like, the 3 or 4 days that I was home, and just be the person that was at everything that I could be, that I could be at. So, like, I've volunteered for all my kids' school events, stuff like I try to be like, hey, if I'm going to be on the road for a couple days, and miss some time, when I'm here, I'm going to be present. I'm going to, you know, be the one that is at everything. And so, I'd love to say like, yeah, I nailed it. I had it down pat, but like, I didn't, like, it was a grind. And that was part of the reason why I, was looking to do something else. And, and then once I started teaching, especially when I was at Quinnipiac, like that was something I realized pretty quickly. I was like, this could be it. This is it. This is a good, transition for me.
I think it's funny that you touched on being present because it's almost like that's a very common theme that
Mm.
I've heard from everyone I've asked. It's if I'm here, I'm here, and
Yeah.
if I'm there, I'm there. And I think that's really true in the sense of like, like you said, if you're at work, you got to be at work, but if you're with your family, you really, you want to spend time with them and get good quality time. You don't want to be, checking emails and all this and that. Um so I did want to talk about, kind of applying your experience to teaching. What are some of the biggest takeaways from your career that you kind of disseminate on students, like some of the biggest lessons that you've learned?
So actual like producing lessons, I go back to what I was saying at the beginning. That's like really that produce your position is a really, I think a really simple and clear, kind of like guideline to have. Like, look, I might be, yeah, not getting coffee, but I might be doing something that I think like, oh, I'm way more qualified. I should be doing this, but this is what I'm doing. So be the best at what you're doing now and figure out a way to make that role better or smoother, or, more supportive for the entire group. Um, it's again, it sounds cliche or it might sound simple, but like communication, just people cannot read your mind. And I think like some of the times where I got most frustrated when I was working is because I thought like I should be doing this or I want to be doing this. My work speaks for itself. Why am I not getting this opportunity? And then I would talk to my superior or my supervisors, be like, hey, I want to do this. And they'd be like, I had no idea you wanted to do that. You've never expressed to me that you want to do that. I didn't know. I thought you were perfectly happy doing what you were doing because you were doing a good job at it. And you were, seemed like you were having fun.
Right.
So I learned pretty quick. I was like, look, like you don't have to, you know, you don't have to be like pushy or it's not being obnoxious. Be like, hey, like I really like what like one day I want to do this. What can I do to do that? Like, how can you see me in that position 3 years from now? And then people know kind of what your goals are, know what you want to do. Um, actual for people that are actually producing or working in live television, something that was told to me that has stuck forever is when you are doing a show, like you have to think of it like you are not watching TV, you are making TV. And if you're in a control room or if you're in a production truck and you're just sitting there, kind of using a line from one of my favorite movies, Hoosiers, like you're just watching the paint dry, like you're behind. Like you are making TV. And so if you are comfortable and like everything's going the way that you think it should be and you're smooth sailing, like you can still be looking ahead. Like, all right, well, what can I be doing? What's coming up next? Or what should I be doing in 5 minutes? What should I be doing in 10 minutes to make sure that
Right.
you're prepared? Like the moment you get caught and you're just sitting there kind of like watching TV, like you are behind. Or you're at least not doing all that you can do. So I think like kind of those sound like simple or I don't want to, like simple like phrases like produce your position, just communicate. People can't read your mind, talk to people. And when you're doing a show, you are not watching TV, you're making TV. Were some of the best lessons that I learned.
I think that's great advice for students. And I think the second thing you said is kind of about like it touches on the old adage of closed mouths don't get fed. Like if you want an opportunity, if you see yourself doing something, like you have to go out and get that opportunity. You have to go open the doors yourself if they're not going to open for you. You have to do everything you can to make it happen because no one's going to just give it to you on a golden platter sometimes. And I think, you're a great example of that. You've worked very hard for all the different roles that you've achieved throughout your career. Um, and talking about some of the evolution in the industry, I did want to ask you, so you've been in the industry and you've seen it evolve from traditional broadcast to streaming platforms. What has been the biggest change in production that you've seen over your career?
It's a good question. Probably like the capability and I don't want to say the ease, but probably the capability and the like efficiency of like at home productions, like remote productions. Some people call them home run Remy productions, but I know everybody loves to be on the, or I shouldn't say everybody, but like a lot of people want to be on the road, want to be at events, and that's awesome. That's like, that's you feel the electricity when you're there. But with a lot of like the economic considerations that networks, companies have to consider, doing a certain amount of live events or live shows from the same facility and, like from home base, for lack of a better term, um, has really like exploded in the last like 10 or 15 years. And there's very few, you know, I think there's very few game broadcasts, where you can tell the difference if the crew is, you know, in Bristol or, in Stamford, Connecticut at NBC Sports. Whereas like it used to be like, hey, if there was a game and it was in the middle of Kansas on a Tuesday night, like everybody's going there that has to produce that game, that has to be a part of that game. But like more and more, like some of those games are being produced out of, the home base location. And I think,
Right.
and I think like doing that, like, I don't want to say doing that for like the regular season games or like kind of like the ho hum games, like, kind of doing it a certain way for, let's just say like, half the games, then makes the other half that you're there more special and might give you the tools to kind of do those more marquee, bigger events like in a big way.
And kind of still staying on the evolution subject. So something I ask everyone about is AI.
Yeah.
So where do you see AI being implemented in a broadcast, and where do you see in the next like 5 years of like how things are going to start changing um, with broadcast itself?
I don't think you can have AI ever calling a game just because I don't think AI can have like recreate emotion or kind of have like that sense of like surprise, like spontaneity, surprise, or whatever. But I'd be shocked if like at some point, we don't see, you know, an AI John Madden at a Super Bowl or something like that, or like 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 it's might sound a little morbid, but like I remember like there was a Field of Dreams baseball game, whatever it was, 7 or 8 years ago, and there was a hologram of Harry Carey singing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game." It looked,
I do remember that
yeah,
actually.
like I mean, hopefully, like the person who made it isn't watching, but like it didn't look the greatest. But I'm a Cubs fan, and like I was like, oh, it's Harry. Like I loved. I knew it was. I knew he was. I knew he had died. I knew he wasn't alive. But seeing Harry Carey sing the seventh inning stretch, I loved it. And so I think like there's probably um, broadcasters or some type of sports figures that if AI recreated those people and like they got all the the blessing from whoever needed to kind of sign off on it, like
The rights and stuff like that.
yeah, like or like the family or like they'll do it. I think like you even saw like when NBC relaunched the NBA recently, they used an AI recreation of I'm blanking on the gentleman's name, but the person that was like the voice of like, this is the NBA and NBC from like the 90s. He had passed away and they cleared it with his family's estate. They recreated his voice to do NBA and NBC promos or voiceovers to kind of recreate that. Like, hey, remember when you watched basketball on NBC in the 90s and it was like, that round ball rock, all that they recreated that voice and like some people liked it. So it's already happening in that regard. Like I'd be shocked if like the next, or I shouldn't be shocked, but I would predict like the next iteration of that is to have AI broadcasters that have passed away be a part of a telecast.
I don't think you're too far off on that one, honestly. And I will say the one thing that I do believe will still be like a definite is that we will have that human element. Like
Yeah.
you said, you still need human commentators, play by play in color. You can't replace that with like a robot, it's just not gonna work. But when it comes to, like camera operators or stuff like that, like some of these things may become more and more automated. And I
Mhm.
think it's interesting to see how those evolve. Um, but now, kind of touching on a reflection question. So, when you look back at your journey all the way from Notre Dame as a student to senior producer and now a professor, what are you most proud of?
Oh, I can't think of one certain thing. Like I'm proud of. I really am proud of like everywhere I worked. I thought like some of the shows that I worked on and like the groups I worked at, like I was proud to be a part of them. I'm not going to say I'm proud like I was proud of what I did, but I was really proud to be a part of like what I thought were like really really good decent groups. Personally, my career as a producer, um, I don't think it's like exaggerated. I think I was known as someone that was maybe a little not, or I was known as someone that was approachable, that you know, tried not to like yell or get down on people. And I've ever since I've stepped away, like, I've reconnected with some people, whether or not to just kind of like touch base or kind of see how they're doing or whatever. And like, I've heard a lot of stories be like, hey, like your shows were some of my favorite to work on because they were fun. Like, we did a lot of creative stuff. Like, you listen to people's ideas, stuff like that. So I think like, at least like as a producer, hopefully I'm remembered as or thought of as one that had a pretty welcoming environment, and that you know people were comfortable to share their ideas and to kind of like yeah, be themselves, like if that makes sense.
I think that's like a great point to make. At the end of the day, in this industry, it's all about who you know. And, like you said, you had a very approachable demeanor at work. And that's really what it takes. You just want to establish good relationships. And it sounds like still to this day, you have a lot of great relationships from the industry. Um, but as for question, that is all from me. If you had anything else you wanted to kind of chime in here, feel free to. But yeah, really appreciate your time.
Yeah, no, it just since like I don't know if like students are gonna watch this, like I found more and more. Um, there's a lot of value in, there's more ways than ever to try to reach out to connect with people in the industry or people in whatever industry that you want to work on. Uh, The more you can just reach out to people and develop relationships, like you said, that aren't like, hey, how are you? I want a job. The more you can just talk to people, get to know those people, pick their brain for 15 minutes, like go on LinkedIn or wherever and just cold call people that you think are interesting. And you think they work at a place where you might want to work at. You might not get a hold of them, but you might reach out to 10 people and 2 people might respond to you. And then all of a sudden be like, hey, I would love to pick your brain. How did you get to where you are? Some of the questions that you asked me, like, what's the best advice you got? And if that's the only time you talk to those people, you've made a contact, and you've learned something from somebody in the industry that you might not have known anyways. But then who knows? A year later down the line, there might be a position that person has a role in filling, and I think they'll remember you as one of the people like, hey, this person just asked for my opinion on something, asked to get my take on something, and didn't ask for me to give them something, or you didn't ask for something in return. Like, like, hey, what's your name? What do you do? I just applied for this job. Can you help me out? Like, like the more you can kind of wait, and like sometimes you have to do that. Like, I'm not going to pretend like that's not how it goes, but I think like the more you can kind of like reach out to people and build relationships without it being transactional every time, I think the more you'll stand out, is what I would say.
And I think, at the end of the day, that's why I started this podcast. I didn't have a lot of podcast production experience. Now I know how to run. This is a one-man show here. I know how to do the whole thing myself here. But it was really to network. Like, I kind of figured, I was like, there's this podcast suite here. Might as well take advantage. The whole point was I just wanted to network with people in the industry, and it doesn't even have to be people in media. I've talked to people in sales. I've talked to people in operations, stuff like that. At the end of the day, it's really just learning more and more. And that's also why I try and record these too, is to like, you know, there's not a ton of people watching, but if you are watching, like, thank you. And, at the end of the day, there's a lot to take away from these conversations with people like yourself. And I think ultimately, like, it will be to my benefit of having sat down for an hour or so at a time with these people. And, down the line, who's to say, they go, oh yeah, I remember Chase. We sat down and talked for an hour. He's a good kid, da da da. So I think really just doing things that are out of your comfort zone. And like you said, just being able to learn more and more is really important.
Couldn't agree with you more. And thank you for having me.
Thank you. And this is episode 5. Thank you for tuning in, and have a great night. Appreciate you.
No problem. Thank you. A lot of fun.